In the absolute hellscape that was Stalingrad, one of history's most brutal battles, one name became a legend: Pavlov's house. It was just this ordinary apartment building, but it turned into this incredible symbol of impossible resistance. So let's dig into the story of this unlikely fortress. So if you go to the city today, it's called Volgograd now, you'll see this. It's a memorial, and it's attached to a totally normal-looking apartment building. But get this, it's built from the actual bricks from the battlefield. So you have to ask yourself, right, what on earth happened here that was so extraordinary? It had to be literally carved into the city's memory forever. All right, to get it, you have to picture late 1942. You have to go right into the meat grinder of the Battle of Stalingrad. I mean, this was urban warfare at its most savage. The city was being ripped apart block by block, and literally every single building could become a fortress. And this is what was left. Just look at this photo. It was taken right after the siege was lifted, and it shows the utter devastation. When you look at that, you really start to get a feel for the sheer violence, the desperate stakes of the fight for this one single building. So, okay, why this building? What made it so important? Well, it wasn't just some random apartment block. It was all about location, location, location. Its position gave the Red Army defenders this commanding view over a major square and a critical stretch of the Volga River. I mean, they could see for a whole kilometer in 3 different directions. It was an absolute tactical linchpin. Okay, so the building is secured. And what happens next is one of the most incredible defensive stands of the entire war. We're talking about a handful of men holding this one position against the full might of the German army for 2 months. And you have to understand, the pressure wasn't just coming from the Germans outside. Stalin himself had issued his infamous Order Number 227, not one step back. For the men inside Pavlov's house, that meant retreat was simply not an option. They were ordered to hold their ground to the last bullet and the last man, period. So how in the world did they do it? Well, they basically turned a civilian home into a death trap. They mined all the approaches, they wrapped the whole building in 4 layers of barbed wire, they stuck machine guns in every single window they could, and here's the really clever part. They knocked holes through the interior walls so they could move around without ever going outside. They even dug a trench to connect back to their own lines for supplies and communication. Absolutely ingenious. Life inside was, well, it was hell. The Germans were attacking multiple times every single day. The defenders even had an anti-tank rifle up on the roof, ambushing tanks by hitting their weaker top armor. But beyond the fighting, they were starving. Water was even scarcer than food. They were sleeping on scraps of insulation wool they ripped out of the pipes. And every single night, there was this constant, harassing fire, just designed to break their will and drive them insane. And they lived like that for 60 days. Think about that. From late September all the way to late November 1942, this tiny garrison just held on, like an island of defiance in a sea of absolute fire. But, the story of the battle itself is really only half the picture. The fight for Pavlov's house was about to transform into something much, much bigger, a powerful national legend. After the war, this story was elevated to official myth status. It started appearing on things like this postage stamp from 1950. The Soviet state made damn sure that every single citizen knew the heroic story of the stand at Pavlov's house. So why was this story so powerful for Soviet propaganda? Well, because it was the perfect story, right? It perfectly encapsulated the exact narrative they wanted to project. The image of the simple, unbelievably tough Soviet soldier who, through just sheer grit and self-sacrifice, could stand up to the supposedly invincible German war machine. And this quote, this is the peak of that legend. It's from Vasily Shukov, the Soviet general in command at Stalingrad. He famously joked that, quote, the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. I mean, what an incredible claim. And that's the line that really cemented the story in history forever. But like with any legend that powerful, historians eventually start digging. They start asking questions. And when they got into the archives, well, they found a much more complicated story. Which brings us to the key question, doesn't it? How much of this incredible story we've all heard is the unvarnished truth, and how much is the powerful myth that grew up around it? Okay, let's look at the first big difference, the intensity of the battle. The legend tells us about these relentless, massive German assaults trying to take the house at all costs. But the archival records, from both the German and Soviet sides, they're a bit quieter. They suggest the assaults were actually more limited, and neither army's official wartime records seem to attach the same monumental importance to the building that the legend does.
And what about the hero of the story, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov? Well, the legend kind of puts him as the sole commander, the big hero. The reality is a little more nuanced. It's true Pavlov's platoon captured the building, but the actual overall commander of the position for most of the siege was a lieutenant named Ivan Afanasyev.
Now, Pavlov was made a hero of the Soviet Union, which is the highest honor you can get. But what's really interesting is that after the war, many of the other soldiers who actually fought and bled there were reportedly, well, bewildered by his fame. They felt the official story, the one that focused everything on this one man, just didn't really reflect the collective group effort they all remembered.
So the historical record might be a little messy, a little complex, but you know what? That hasn't diminished the power of the legend one bit. The story of Pavlov's house continues to capture our imagination, even to this day.
And that brings us right back to where we started. On the left, you see the ruin from 1943. On the right, the memorialized building as it stands today. That jump through time really shows you how a place of such brutal, horrible conflict has been transformed into a site of permanent memory. And believe me, this legend is very much alive today, especially in popular culture. I mean, if you've ever played games like Call of Duty or Hell Let Loose, or there's even a VR game called Pavlov, heck, even the board game Undaunted Stalingrad, you have been a part of retelling this very story. You know, back in 2015, the last known survivor of the defense, a man named Kamaljan Turganov, he passed away at the age of 93. And with his death, the story of Pavlov's house officially transitioned from living memory into pure history. It's preserved now only in records, memorials, and, of course, in these incredibly powerful legends. And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The story of Pavlov's house, this amazing symbol of incredible courage, it might not be a perfectly accurate historical account, but its power to inspire, that's undeniable. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? When does a story, a legend, become more important than the cold, hard facts?